This is Social Media in Labor Relations and Student Contact, Best Policies, Practices, and Training, from the 41st Annual Conference of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions at Hunter College, held at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City, April 6 to 8, 2014. The panelists are Henry Reichman, Vice President of the American Association of University Professors, Michael Locanto, Associate Director of Labor and Employee Relations at Harvard University, and Nicole Kendall, Associate Professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Tennessee State University. With moderator Jeffrey Cross, the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Eastern Illinois University.
As I said, my name is Jeff Cross. I'm Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Eastern Illinois University. I've been asked to moderate the panel, and I also serve on the board of the National Center, and along with Steve Hicks, co-edit the Journal of Collective Bargaining in the Academy. Much has been written and reported about social media and its use in education in general and in higher education in particular. Some of what has been written has been published in the Journal of Collective Bargaining in the Academy. I refer specifically to Jim Castignera and John Lanza IV's article entitled Social Networking and Faculty Discipline, a Pennsylvania Case Points Toward Confrontational Times Requiring Collective Bargaining Attention. They wrote that an associate professor at East Stroudsburg University, one of the 14 state-owned universities in Pennsylvania, had posted on her Facebook page, and I'll quote, "Had a good day today, didn't want to kill even one student," end quote. Previously, she had written, "Does anyone know where I can find a very discreet hitman? It's been that kind of day," end quote. The associate professor was placed on leave, and the interim provost at that institution was quoted as follows: "Given the climate of security concerns in academia, the university has an obligation to take all threats seriously and act accordingly." Bill Herbert, the executive director of the National Center, wrote in the Northern Kentucky Law Review, I'll quote again, "The use of digital devices and their networks is reshaping culture and our workplaces, metamorphosing formerly deniable or forgettable verbal exchanges into discoverable, distributable, electronic written records." The Chronicle of Higher Ed reported last fall from the University of Kansas that when they placed a journalism associate professor on administrative leave for a tweet denouncing the National Rifle Association following yet another tragic mass shooting in the Washington Navy Yard that left 13 dead. The tweet read, and I'll quote, "The blood is on the hands of the hashtag NRA. Next time, let it be your sons and daughters. Shame on you. May God damn you," end quote. In a release, the chancellor wrote, and I'll quote again, "In order to prevent disruptions to the learning environment for students, the School of Journalism and the university, I have directed the provost to place the associate professor on indefinite administrative leave pending a review of the entire situation." The Kansas suspension was lifted, and the Kansas Board of Regents adopted a policy and rules under which faculty members and other members can be fired for improper use of social media. Now, with that brief introduction, I now turn to our esteemed panelists who will provide their perspectives on the topic as follows. I'm going to introduce them now, and they'll just follow in order. First is Nicole Kendall. She is Associate Professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning at Tennessee State University. Dr. Kendall trains teachers and students on how to incorporate technology within the classroom, presents nationally and internationally on topics such as classroom management, millennial learners, and digital citizenship, and continues to work diligently in her field preparing pre-professional educators for teaching, learning, and advocacy of children and public education. Michael Lecanto, to my immediate right, has served as Associate Director of the Office of Labor and Employee Relations at Harvard University since 2006. His primary role includes advising and consulting with school and department managers on the interpretation and administration of the university's employment policies and collective bargaining agreements, including problem solving, grievance administration, and mediation. He also represents the university in contract negotiations with employee collective bargaining units and participates in university and joint labor management committees and conducts supervisory and policy-based training. Prior to joining Harvard, Mike practiced as a labor counsel for the City of Boston's Office of Labor Relations. He received a bachelor's degree from Florida State University and his law degree from Northeastern University School of Law. To my left is Henry, also known as Hank Reichman, is professor of emeritus of history at California State University, East Bay. He is first vice president of the AAUP and chair of AAUP's Committee A on Academic Freedom and Tenure. He is also a founding member of the California Faculty Association and was a member of its collective bargaining team for 9 years. And we have a very distinguished panel, and we'll start with Nicole.
Well, I want to say good afternoon to everyone. I'm delighted that you are here because I know that I have the arduous task to hold your attention at the worst time of the day, but I love my topic. I love education, and I think social media is absolutely awesome, but it is a great challenge that I think we as educators, whether you're coming from a higher ed background, K-12 background, and certainly as administrators, that we have to look at very closely. So in the course of my presentation, I looked at the title and I changed one particular word, which is best, because I truly feel that we are looking for the most effective practice, knowing that whatever technology is here today will look a lot different tomorrow, as well as the fact that our students are looking for innovative ways to make learning relevant to them. And that can be somewhat of a challenge when I know that a lot of my colleagues across the country, and certainly as I traveled across the world, it looks a little bit different than how they were trained. Because we were taught in a very 20th century mindset that you sit, you stare, you take notes, you fake it to make it, you do the old school smile and nod, and if you're really good, you give a little or a sound effect, hoping that the instructor wouldn't call on you. And I'm actually a fan of thinking that one of the reasons why social media alarms a lot of our faculty across the country and probably across the world is because we're not used to getting instant feedback to say that we might be a little bit boring. And that maybe it's not social media, but maybe it's a social indicator that says that we as educators need to do something a little bit different. Now, before you throw your tomatoes or whatever left is out there in the snack bar at me, let that ponder for a moment. That might have been your afternoon wake me up. That maybe, just maybe, after all of these years, and I dare say in education, probably centuries of sitting idle and only relying on auditory and visual means of instruction, maybe we're finally having the backlash of those tactile, kinesthetic, I think I'm ADD, but I'm probably just bored type of learners that are saying, give me something to do. And now let my mighty ninja thumbs just tweet away about what's going on in my experience and making my life, my lesson, my learning more relevant. So actually what you see on the screen is how I introduce myself to my students, because I don't do handouts. And if you are looking for one, you are more than willing and welcome to scan that lovely QR code and contact me for this presentation, which you will receive this afternoon before I go to bed, because I really want to make sure that my students are having real-time learning. But I also know that what you see on the screen and what you hear out of my voice within the next 9.5 minutes may not be relevant to you at all. And I'm here to say, as instructors, we have to be okay with that. Because maybe, just maybe, what I'm telling you should not be in your long-term memory or even your short-term memory. Maybe it's just good, relevant information just for that second. Because that's what teaching and learning looks like in 2014. But again, that's a conversation that we haven't had. And when you take that up to administration and talk about real-time evaluations versus midterm evaluations versus end of the semester evaluation, it really changes the context to what our students are responding to. Are they really evaluating me on how well they made it through the hurdle? They survived. They get a trophy, a grade, a cookie. Oh, is that what the end of the semester really means in terms of my course evaluation? Or do I really need to respond to the immediate tweet, email, text message, Facebook post that I received that day that will let me know if I got into that realm of relevancy or if I just popped a bleep on just random knowledge? You also see my Twitter feed because, again, when my students talk about me, I kind of want to know. It hurts. I won't lie. It hurts. But I think that's more relevant to whether they like the time the class was offered, because I teach an 8 o'clock class for undergraduates. Get what those evaluations are going to be. And then I teach a nighttime class on a Thursday night for graduate students. Guess what those evaluations are going to look like? So I don't want to know how great someone scheduled my class because I have no control over that. What I do want to know is that what information I presented to them, what resources I'm bringing to them, is it relevant? So I actually start off my class with technology, so I'm going to take a little bit of my time to entertain you with a video on terms of what social media looked like in 2013.
14.
Nope, 14 is still going on. We're at 2013.
Here's a quick look at this. Take it a moment. Technology
It may freeze up, but that's fine.
2013. This is
Okay, maybe we won't. We'll go on for time and prosperity.
Because it was 2013.
2013 apparently wasn't a good year. Maybe it was the 13 part.
All technology.
So here's the thing. What you would have found out in there in that particular video, which I'm actually glad that's a wonderful teachable moment, because that's one of the reasons why teachers don't use technology, is because when it doesn't work, they freak out. And students, that's the first thing that they'll tweet is professor freaking out. Technology not working. But here's the thing. Also understanding social media requires you to be an expert, which is why I have the following slide right after that. Because you have to know your content and you have to know where your students are, where you can direct them in the moment. Because social media, in my opinion, offers a new world of having shared dialogue. What am I saying compared to what is out there right now? That's also a new learning shift for a lot of my colleagues who are not used to students checking their lectures. Isn't that weird? It used to be, your instructor said, oh, there's 9 planets. And then that one student in the back that actually watches, National Geographic says, no, NASA voted Pluto out. Neptune, one of them, it's out, it's gone. It's like, no, on the test, it's 9 planets. It says, well, NASA, who's smarter than you, said that we dropped a planet. That used to be shared dialogue. Now we have students that are in a very much robotic mode that are just going back to just notes, and if it's going to be on the test, that's all I need to know. What we see on the screen is the fact that we need to kind of reshape what administration assumes that technology is going to look like on their campus, which will help shape instructors to understand what students are wanting them to look like when we have this conversation about social media. Because I personally think the gap lies in the fact that we're not modeling proper use of social media, because the instructors who are supposed to guide students in proper etiquette, proper understanding, they're not using it. They're actually quite terrified of it. They've heard of Twitter, but they don't tweet. They heard of Facebook, but have no face. It's just the avatar of a gray person looking at nothing. And yet we have such strong opinions and policies about using cell phones in the classrooms and how we're going to handle tablets. And even when I look around this room, it's not very social media friendly unless you're lucky enough to claim the outlet when you walk in the room. So what we're basically telling students is to power off in a digital age when everything is turned on. So we have to re-examine that. What I have on the screen are basically the International Society for Technology and Education standards. You will notice that there's a gold star for every single circle, whether it's an administrator, a technology coach, a teacher, or a student. which basically means that we have to have a true shared conversation about technology, its education, and its ongoing professional practice. That I don't have a problem that there are social media policies. In fact, they definitely should be in place. But having a policy in absence of actual practice causes problems. You can tweet that. They don't allow you to tweet in here, but that's okay. You can tweet that, write it down, and then go outside and tweet. I'll let you. You can say Kendall did so. But you have to have that visionary leadership, and I'm assuming that my colleagues will also expand on that, because it is important to understand that you don't want to have your colleagues walking into some of the situations that were presented in the opening, where we're making poor decisions and choices about how we share our thoughts to our community, to our students at large. That yes, even online, I still have to represent my different entities, whether I'm a professor at Tennessee State University, the members of my sorority, the members of my church, that when I'm online, I actually am in public. And unfortunately, unlike Beyonce, I do not have a PR rep that when I say something stupid, they'll go back and say what she really meant to say was that she had a wonderful day and she loved having a 5:30, 15-something ending session on a Monday in New York. Got that on camera. Okay. So what I wanted to show you next is basically what our college students are looking like. They're addicted to their cell phones. I've traveled everywhere. And I know everyone throws out that argument, everyone doesn't have cell phones. You're wrong, they do. And they're using them. They have mighty thumbs that will kill you if you punch them the wrong way with that good thumb. But look at the percentages of how these students are using their cell phones. And here's the thing, the cell phone costs more than the book. But they have the cell phone and not your book, which tells me that they're accessing learning somewhere else. So that means that from a social media standpoint, we have to look at how are they communicating and how that translates the information over from classroom into real world relevancy. That maybe it wasn't so much the comment or that got the the content that got the instructors in trouble, but oftentimes the context and how they should have thought more intellectually about how they would frame their thoughts. Because the reality is we do social media all the time in our classrooms. It's just that the door is closed. And the only people that we're tweeting to are within the room. We hope, because I see some of you with your phones out. The next slide looks at where they're communicating. And oftentimes that occurs outside your classroom. They're just staring at you. So hopefully you look good when they're staring. But a lot of learning is going on at home. They're talking at McDonald's, at the park, in the movies. They're talking. Don't we want them to talk? I mean, the aspect of this conversation is not so much the media, but that they're social. So again, when we're looking at the policies, we have to talk about how we understand the rules of being social to an audience that's going beyond our classroom. And that's, again, what changes the conversation versus just saying, don't talk. We're teachers. That's kind of oxymoron because I thought we were trained to talk. But nonetheless, instead of saying don't talk, but how to educate our students to make wise choices when they're talking to a larger audience at home. And I would dare say in this day and age, it really changes and reshapes the dynamics of our communication classes and our general ed courses, because we're used to talking about those speeches, the persuasive, the expressive. But we're not talking about what does that mean when your voice can reach all the way across the globe. That the university president, who doesn't even know me, may see my words and understand how those words may shape how another potential student may decide on my institution or another institution because of my words. And again, this is a generation that didn't realize that their voice had that much power, because they're not really marching per se. I mean, they don't walk. They'll text about walking, but they're not marching like those previous generations, like the baby boomers marched. They're not having those massive out there revolutions, but at the same time, their words have power. So here are just some tools that I talk about in terms of getting people aware of how we do the research, because and how we develop social media. I actually work with my colleagues and students at the same time on using a variety of tools of making sure that they're building relationships and they're building healthy relationships when they're communicating online. Now, they have a variety of different purposes, and most of the time I ask the teachers or the students or even the administrators, what does your unit need? And where do they need that education and that understanding around social media? And then we do goal setting. And I don't mean for good gracious, not the whole academic year, but what do you want to see in terms of transformation, even up to midterms? Fall break, oh my mercy. Spring break, have mercy. What should you post, what should you not post? How do you express yourself but still maintain your integrity? How do you protect yourself from online discrimination when your words go beyond that classroom and can impact the job that you hope to have 3 or 4 years from now? Those are the conversations that we need to start looking at, because those are the conversations that are impacting our students that have not reached their college doors yet, but are changing and shaping how high school students are being admitted to universities. So I won't take questions right now, but I'll pause and pass the mic to my colleague to my left. Thank you very much.
I can't believe I have to follow that. I think it's going to be very apparent, who teaches in a class every day and who sits in a windowless conference room negotiating contracts. But I'll do my best. Thank you, Nicole. And do you mind if I just reach across? I'm going to pull this mouse over here. So hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I think the first thing I'm going to do for social media purposes is I'm going to go onto one of my iPhone apps that I have here, which has a timer on it. So I'm going to time myself, and hopefully it'll eject me from the seat when I hit 15 minutes or something like that, for your sake. So I want to talk about a couple different things today. And I have a legal background. I don't do law every day, but it kind of helps inform the way that I approach social media in a variety of different contexts at the university that I work at. My primary role is, as Jeff mentioned earlier, negotiating contracts, but I write policy for the university as well. And we find our ways into many other areas. And so when we began looking at social media as something that was, quote, policy worthy at my university in around 2010, 2011, the first question we asked was, well, this isn't specifically an employee issue. What are the areas that we need to be looking in across the institution when we want to think about developing a holistic approach to dealing with social media in the institution? So I'm going to skip around a little bit, but here's a couple different scenarios that I'll put out there for your consideration as I'm talking through some of the context that social media arises in, principally in negotiation, in dealings with students, other faculty, visitors to your campus, and also just in the day-to-day work relationship that an institution has with its employees. So I'll read these for you. I'm not sure that this is probably a bit hard to read with the screen up here, but I'll go through the scenarios very quickly. The first one is, over the last 9 months, your campus president has made some unpopular budgetary decisions. A coalition of activist staff and faculty have created a Facebook page devoted to pressuring for his resignation. It has caught on like wildfire on campus and beyond. Second scenario. As an HR director, you have worked to no avail to negotiate the separation of a long-term, popular, but underperforming employee. You learn that he has been tweeting his many friends and colleagues saying that you are discriminating against him and trying to force him out. Third scenario. A manager, not a manger, pardon my, that's a different scenario, of work study students has allowed several students to friend her. A month later, another friend posts obscene jokes on the manager's wall. The students who read it complain that they've been exposed to a hostile work environment. Now, thinking about these three scenarios, we can start off by thinking, what could we do policy-wise to prevent or otherwise influence the way that these scenarios play out on our campuses? The first one, probably not much. That's more of an external relations issue, when you're dealing with this. It's an internal and an external relations issue when you're dealing with budget issues at a very high level. With the underperforming employee, is that person's speech protected? They're making a claim about discrimination. It may be. It might not be as well, but there's a potential for a policy written in the right way to have some influence on how your institution goes about dealing with that. How specifically, if you're acting as the scenario lays out as an HR director, how you go about addressing the issue. And in the third situation, where you've got a manager dealing with some work study students, and you're having you're experiencing some communications between two different groups there, staff and students, you might actually have a pretty effective policy out there that could have either acted in a prophylactic nature and prevented that from ever occurring, or give you effective ways to deal with the situation from a number of different perspectives. So let's flip forward. We've got a number of different social media policies floating out there right now in a number of different industries. When I first started taking a look, my institution first started taking a look back in 2011, I was surprised to find that there was several dozen colleges and universities at the time that had enacted social media policies that were effective on their campuses. And so my effort was not to recreate the wheel, but think about the way that those models could be presented in a way that best reflected the values and goals of our university community. And I'd encourage you all to do the same. I haven't checked in a number of years, but there's a good website called socialmediagovernance.org that has a compendium of these policies, and they're not limited to colleges and universities as well. Just as much guidance that we took from notable institutions like DePaul, Tufts, I believe Michigan had a great policy at the time. We took some real good material from places like Eli Lilly, Pfizer, heavily regulated industries like pharmaceuticals as well. And that's because of these considerations that we put out there. You've got legal, contractual, and reputational considerations that you want to think about. Again, when drafting a policy, but also, this is what I'm really talking about is just your institutional approach to communications. And so, I'll focus a little bit for just a second on the contractual issue. For any of us that have collective bargaining on campus, we've got 9 unions and 6,000 unionized employees on our campus. No faculty, but folks in a variety of different service and trades and clerical technical roles, as well as a pretty robust vendor workforce and a construction workforce. We've got a lot of issues to deal with at any one time, and so when we're thinking about the way that we rolled out our social media policy, we also thought about how the existing policy structure that we had at the university would interrelate with the way that we approached collective bargaining. So I'd urge you to take a look at what your existing university policies are when you're thinking about perhaps enacting some social media guidelines as well. And you want to consider, most importantly, what is it that you want to influence, impact, control, what have you on your campus when you have a social media policy. And control can be a tricky word to use. There's so much that you can't control in social media that it's almost folly to think about that as approach a policy from that perspective. But nonetheless, if you're thinking about what you can and you cannot control, then that can crystallize much more clearly what it is that a policy or guidelines might be able to accomplish in this area. And so that's why I'll take you to the next slide here, which talks a little bit more about what those specific constituents and stakeholders are on campus. And so, we're all familiar with each of these issues. and as I mentioned earlier, you certainly want to think about a policy from a number of different perspectives. One thing I will add that I don't have on the slide here, but obviously is, you know, sort of like a duh moment for all of us, which is academic freedom, right? We had some draft versions of our policies floating around when we were meeting with different institutional stakeholders. When we got to the faculty affairs deans, they said, well, we've got 2 monumental pages-long statements about academic freedom at the university. Where are they? And so we made sure that we included that, because obviously when you're thinking about, when you're approaching some sort of policy or, you know, collective bargaining as well, from the perspective of trying to limit or otherwise regulate speech, the first thing that the largest and most important group on your campus, which is your faculty, is going to say is, well, why should I bother listening to this? What's in it for me? You know, I mean, what is it? Who am I to bow down to regulations that would otherwise limit my speech? That's what you pay me for, to be a free thinker. And so we had to think long and hard about how to effectively include that. And I'll note on that, at that point, you know, I didn't bring copies of my guidelines today for the specific reason because they're under review and about to be edited and relaunched in version 2.0. So I will, I have my draft notes here if anybody wants to talk about them after the panel, of course, but if you want to go to security.harvard.edu, that's our external site. It's managed by our IT folks. We'll have them posted up there by probably late May, early June. And again, I'll upload them to that social media governance site. So we talked a little bit about, you know, the areas that social media policies and guidelines might be used. Why are they important? Well, as I mentioned, there's a number of different perspectives that you can take when you're looking at a policy, but you know, legal, reputational, what have you. The legal piece, those Facebook cases that we all know that have been, you know, percolating out there in the public discourse for a number of years here, they're appearing at all different levels. And so I cited a case here, and it's admittedly a few years ago, but it just is meant to give an example of how that national conversation, you know, the board cases, those Facebook cases, I think it was the Buffalo psychiatric ward case that everybody knows, has trickled down in large part to a number of states. And this is, you know, my home state of the Commonwealth, pardon me, Massachusetts, with a firefighter that was fired from his job for making a series of homophobic slurs over Facebook about one of his supervisors, and it was found to be not protected despite its seeming connection to a conversation about terms and conditions of employment. You'll find that elsewhere, and you'll find in a lot of these cases, just as in the hostile work environment scenario that I laid out earlier, that it's hard to disentangle the seemingly inflammatory commentary that you find in a lot of these cases from what is or isn't the protected speech, the speech that specifically relates to terms and conditions of employment. And I'll direct you to another case that you can actually find several of them out there, but there's an NLRB case from 2010 in New Jersey called Monmouth Ocean Hospital Service Corp., where a lot of similar speech as in the Bourne firefighter case took place, and that those individuals were terminated as well. And the termination was upheld despite the fact that there was quite a bit of protected speech included in the same Facebook posts. So this is tough stuff, you know, and in 15 minutes, and I'm at minute 12, as my app tells me, it's hard to talk through all of it in detail, but I'm sure we can answer a lot of these specific questions in the question portion. So I'll just go through, talk a little bit more. As I mentioned, you want to think a lot about, what it is that you're looking to regulate. You want to ensure that every policy that you have out there, and by the way, I am speaking specifically from the management perspective here, but I'm trying to come at it from a number of different angles for you. But when I do slip into saying, if you want to invoke a policy, this is the way to go about it, that's just my nature. Concerted protected activity is what you need to have in every policy. If you don't have it in your policy, any regulator out there is going to tell you this policy doesn't work. And there's a number of policies out there that the board, for everyone's benefit, has said these pass muster. Now, the Harvard policy, we chose not to control personal conduct, We're only controlling the way that people speak in the context of being authorized to speak on behalf of the university. So that's a key difference, and that's what, at least I believe, limits us from any potential liability under the Facebook cases series of rulings. But nonetheless, we still have that concerted protected activity in there, because people can read a 7-page policy and say, oh, I'm not supposed to tweet about work, and we don't want people to get that impression. But nonetheless, there's a serious policy out there if you are looking, if your institution is looking to regulate personal conduct on social media as well. I don't recommend it, but Sears seems to have figured out how to do it right. And oddly enough, Walmart has as well. So if you want to take a look at that policy, those are two well-respected policies in the labor community. I have specific examples that maybe I could defer to the question and answer period if you have specific questions about them, but I did have a couple good stories about how social media has wound its way into negotiations, and so I'll save that if you have specific questions on it. And I'll leave you with just some comments about who you want to coordinate with. I talked about this earlier. When you're thinking about a social media policy, it doesn't begin and end at the bargaining table. It extends through all facets of your community. As I said, the easiest way to think about it is, how do you communicate with all the different constituencies on your campus? Social media is just another way of speaking. It doesn't change the conversation, it amplifies it, right? So from that perspective, you want to make sure that you have every stakeholder that has any sort of role in speaking to any constituent on your campus involved in that conversation. And I think we can take a break from that.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Well, when my family heard I was going to be speaking on a panel on social media, they just all broke up into laughter, because I'm the only member of the family who's not on Facebook. I do have a Twitter account, but I've only tweeted once. But what I'm here to be the person from the faculty who Michael referred to. He said, well, what about the academic freedom part? I want to talk about academic freedom and social media, in particular with regard to social media policy. So let me begin by pointing out that about a month ago, the Chronicle of Higher Education ran an article reporting on a survey that they did of faculty leaders at a number of campuses about whether their campus had policies governing use of social media. And over half of the respondents to that survey said their campus had no policy governing social media. Now, first of all, I actually think that was probably not true. I think some of them didn't know about the policy, some of them didn't realize the policy. A lot of campuses have policy on electronic communications in general. I mean, even if the policy is you need a password to log on, that's a policy right there. But what is interesting to me was in the article that Peter Schmidt wrote about that survey, several people were quoted, including, I think, someone from FIRE, Foundation on Individual Rights in Education, saying this is a good thing because we don't need to regulate social media. It should be free. People should be free to say what they want, which of course, as the AAUP, the primary advocate for academic freedom in the United States, we essentially sympathize with. However, I was quoted in the article, and I'm here to say again today that we don't agree. We think you need policies. And it's precisely the lack of policy that leaves faculty vulnerable to the kind of actions that are often taken by desperate administrations confronted with a controversy, pressure from the outside, et cetera, and they have no policy foundation to turn to. Needless to say, you need a good policy, not a bad policy, but you need a policy. I'm not here, however, to tell you what the policy should be. AAP does not generally, we don't have model policies. We don't tell you exactly what to say. We recognize that every institution is different. We recognize in particular in the collective bargaining environment, the policy may not be what is desired by either side. It's a compromise. That faculty handbooks are often written that way. What I want to focus in on, however, is the centrality we believe needs to be in any social media, or really broadly electronic communications policy, of academic freedom. And in that light, I want to talk about some aspects of a rather long report that we have just completed called Academic Freedom of Electronic Communications. There are copies up here. This is a revision of a report that policy report we originally did in 2004. And obviously it was time to review and renew it because in 2004 there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter. There was an outsourcing of email services to Google. There wasn't cloud computing. And there wasn't bring your own device to campus, be it a smartphone or a laptop or an iPad or what have you. So that was the impetus, and I led the effort on this, and the report covers a number of different things, which I won't cover today. It covers questions of who can have access to university electronic communications facilities, covers questions of privacy, questions of freedom of information requests, which is a big issue when outside groups come in and ask for all the old emails from somebody who's been doing research on something controversial, and how does the university respond? What I want to talk about today is particularly social media, because that's the topic of our panel, and particularly two aspects of the academic freedom in social media. Social media can be used in research, and actually our report does talk about one aspect of it, which is at academic conferences, the growing practice of people twittering or tweeting, I don't know which is the verb, which is whatever, about what's going on in the presentation, which is a wonderful thing in the sense that it broadens the discussion. On the other hand, of course, many of us go to a conference to try out some ideas, and we're used to having not for circulation beyond the conference on our paper, because it's our first attempt. And suddenly the whole world knows about our research and is willing to jump on us before we're ready. So this is an issue we dealt with. I'm not going to go into it very deeply here. We talk a little bit about social media in the classroom, but I'm not going to talk about that. I certainly don't have anything close to Nicole's experience or expertise in that area. What I want to talk about particularly is that aspect of social media which falls under the boundaries of first extramural speech, which literally is speech beyond the walls of the university, which is essentially when university faculty members speak as citizens on issues of public concern. And also certain kind of intramural speech when university faculty speak on issues of policy within the university, which may also be matters of public concern. Budget of a state university certainly should be. But may also be, about the fact that the department chair is a jerk. And is really internal to the university. And our position in this report has been to reaffirm the basic stance that we took in 2004, which is that, and I'll quote, academic freedom, free inquiry, and freedom of expression within the academic community may be limited to no greater extent in electronic format than they are in print, save for the most unusual situation where the very nature of the medium itself might warrant unusual restrictions. And we believe that applies to social media as well. That faculty who post on Facebook, who Twitter, who simply send out mass emails, who blog, who whatever, have the same rights as they should have if they wrote an op-ed piece, if they wrote a scholarly article, if they gave a speech at a campaign rally for somebody off campus or some other event. They have the same right to say what they wish and the same right, to be honest, to make fools of themselves sometimes. Where there aren't policies guaranteeing that, we run into trouble. And let me talk about 3 recent incidents we've had experience with. One is in Colorado, at Colorado State University, Pueblo, which is in the southern part of the state. There has been a struggle going on there over threatened faculty layoffs stemming from an alleged funding shortage in the state. Many people believe it's an attempt to take money out of a university that mainly serves the poorer part of the state, the more Latino part of the state, and take it to the wealthier Denver suburbs and Boulder suburbs. And we have a wonderful AAUP chapter there, not collective bargaining. Been fighting this, and one of our colleagues there sent out I can't remember, it was a mass email actually, but he could have put it on Facebook, could have put it on Twitter, in which he called attention to the fact that 2014, in fact, just a couple of weeks, will be the 100th anniversary of the Ludlow Massacre, which took place also in southern Colorado, where striking coal miners were shot down by state militia serving the Rockefeller mining interests. And he colorfully sent out a message that said, the attempts threats to fire all these faculty is a 21st century equivalent for our university of the Ludlow Massacre. And the university claimed that he was threatening violence. It was clearly, he's an historian, by the way. It was clearly a metaphor, an historical reference. And they barred him from access to email. They soon restored his access, but only to individuals. He could not use any listservs of which he was a member on the campus. Now, he didn't want this to become the big issue. He wanted to still focus on the threatened layoffs, so he didn't fight it too much, but I'll let you in on a little secret that on the anniversary of the Ludlow Massacre, I will expect to see quite a number of emails on the Colorado State University Pueblo campus making a comparison between the Ludlow Massacre and some of their current events. The second example is the one that Jeff mentioned in the introduction, which is, of course, Kansas, where there was that tweet, and which then resulted in the Kansas Board of Regents announcing in December a new policy governing social media, which is we may not offer model policies, but I'll tell you, this is a model not good policy. And it was uniformly condemned. They took every legal language they could find to say you could have an excuse to fire somebody if basically you disrupted the operations, if you fostered bad relationships among people. I mean, it's really terrible. They got a lot of criticism in this regard, not only from faculty. AAUP issued a national statement, so did our Kansas conference, but also by the university presidents in Kansas who said, are you crazy? We're not going to be able to implement this policy. And of course the policy was devised totally without participation. In this case, it was equal opportunity denial of participation. Neither the campus administrators nor the faculty were involved. They are now agreed to review the policy, but they have still not revoked it. A third example is Chicago State University, where there is a dissident group of faculty that runs a blog criticizing the current administration. And they have a little photograph there from the Chicago State campus with their CSU symbol in a hedge, the university threatened them with trademark violation. Because we all know CSU is a trademark. I come from California State University. I've been encouraging our administration to challenge Chicago State for taking our initials, and Connecticut State and Colorado State and whatever. The faculty members who have been charging cronyism in the administration cleverly changed the title from Chicago State University Alta to Crony State University. But they're still being threatened with this. So these are obviously extreme examples of foolish thinking, but they're what can come if you haven't had a policy. Now, how do you get a good policy? Again, we don't have specific recommendations, but we have some ideas about how it should be done. The first thing is you've got to involve the faculty. For many, and this is something that not just the administration has to learn, but the faculty themselves, because many faculty members sit there and go, I don't know about electronic communications. I have a hard time using Blackboard. Yeah, okay, I can email now, but Facebook, that's my kid. Or I do Facebook outside, but it's not me. And they get overwhelmed when the IT people tell them real university concerns about the fact that, for example, many universities, particularly big research universities, are subject to literally hundreds of thousands of hacking attempts, not only by the day, but by the hour or even minute. And so they are very concerned with the security of their systems, as they well should be. When, of course, they go, oh, I don't understand that stuff. It's too important to be left to the IT people. Faculty can't do it alone. Probably neither can people like Michael. We need the technical people as well. But the faculty need to be at the table. Second, you have to understand, what can you legitimately limit? One thing that's obvious is there are laws. Student records, student information cannot be posted in ways that are publicly accessible. It's against the law. Threats of violence, legitimate threats of violence, not emails about the Ludlow massacre. Then you have to carefully define them. And finally, you need to make clear what needs to be permitted. And finally, there needs to be a general principle that defines that when in doubt, we favor openness and we favor academic freedom. And I want to conclude with language from the University of California's electronic communications policy, which is by and large, I think, a pretty good one, in which they write, in general, the university cannot and does not wish to be the arbiter of the contents of electronic communications. Neither can the university always protect users from receiving electronic messages they might find offensive. I think a simple statement like that in a policy can go a long way to setting a more appropriate tone for academic freedom and still permit the reasonable and necessary regulation of electronic communications in the university.
Thank you, Hank. And now it's your turn to be the social part of the social media panel. And if you have questions, now's the time.
I have kind of two questions. One would be about how to deal with faculty members who are charged by their colleagues of not sending the occasional offensive email, but really what people are referring to as cyberbullying through the university, say, listserv about. The second thing is, what about boundaries between students and faculty or students and employees when students' understanding increasingly of what's appropriate is changing? We had a case at Mary Ann Mahoney from Central Connecticut. We had a case a couple of years ago of a student who had created a blog on hot faculty, right? Like hot people on campus, and there were faculty turning up on it and other students, and it was really for those faculty who were listed on it. What would be the implication if they had in any way responded to this?
I'm asked to, thank you, Maria, and thank you for identifying yourself. I'm asked to repeat the questions for the recording purposes, and it's a two-part question. One asks the panelists to address faculty cyberbullying, And the second element is to address the boundaries for faculty-student exchange.
I probably can address the second issue. So I'll leave bullying to other folks who might know a little bit more about it. But you know, from the perspective of the policy that we put together at Harvard, the approach was that it would be an overlay, right? So there's no mandates in the policy that we have. With our guidelines, what we try to impart on individuals that speak on behalf of the university, and again, I'll repeat that phrase, behalf of the university only. Some of the principles that you might want to take into account when you're speaking through this medium of social media, any of the different outlets that you might have, Twitter, Facebook, what have you. So when we do that, we thought about, when we went out and talked to all these different constituencies on campus, what are the types of situations that might come up. And so one of those was, okay, so what do we do when we have you know, an interaction between faculty and students on Facebook or you know, wherever else. The reality is that you can't stop someone from going out and using these things. It's just the barriers to entry are so low that, you know, you can open up a Facebook account and start talking about things in 30 seconds, right? But for folks that find their way to a policy and stop to think about, okay, if I'm going to start using this in connection with the way that I approach my job, my academic exploits, what have you, then you can get them to start thinking about things like, you know, the permanency of the speech that you're putting onto the web, the way in which you might send something off into the ether in you know, a fit of emotion, only to wish you could have it back. Well, you know, unfortunately with the internet, you know, anything that you put out there is never coming back. One of the things I love to throw out when I talk about social media is the fact that the Library of Congress is cataloging every tweet ever tweeted, I guess is the right way to put it. So if you said anything on Twitter about anything, it's in the Library of Congress now, waiting for someone to do something with that data. So, you know, chew on that when you think about what you're putting out there. But in any case, I mean, I think the best, to sum it up, the best thing you can do with a policy is to give people specific concrete examples. And so with our policy, we reinforce through speech, through examples, and through a 10-minute tutorial. If you go to the employee version of the policy, and when I say employee version, if you go and look on the security site that I quoted earlier, it's just a PDF. If you go to the employees intranet where we have the policy, there's also a button you can click on for a 10-minute tutorial. It's essentially, so you want to use Facebook now type approach. It'll tell you about, you know, these are things you want to look out for, the FERPA issues that Hank mentioned earlier, some HIPAA issues if you're, you know, working at our medical school, and all of those types of legal concerns or just daily interaction concerns that might be cause for concern.
And I'll add to that. It all goes back to the context of how you're communicating. I have 2 Facebook pages. One is for professional use and one is for me and my group of idiots that I call my friends, everybody. Okay, so when I work with, and I show my students the 2, I take a screenshot of the 2 pages and I talk to them about the context of who is being represented. Now, Dr. Kendall is how you met me. I have about 200 teacher ed candidates from over the 9 years that I've been at the university on that Facebook page. But they're doing mentoring to the current candidates. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, when I see the students post there, I got my 10-year pin at X county school. I mean, I'm elated because when we're doing homecoming activities, fundraising activities, I have a better network of my students and my teacher ed candidates than the human resource office or the teacher ed office. But it's that context. But I celebrate their birthdays and their professional accomplishments, but that's where the line is drawn. Now, that is oftentimes what is missing when faculty engage in those interactions in social media. They're very cognitive of it when they have graduate assistants and TAs and they're doing research projects or going on a field trip. We're clear on those boundaries because those policies exist. But it's when you move into a social environment and basically you're making the world know that you have this teacher-faculty relationship, you also have to put that outer shell around it to say, this is what this relationship is for, and that's the only reason why we're communicating. And when we're done, we're done. And so we do that for our doctoral groups. We have a lot of faculty that are mentors of student organizations on campus. So I think it goes back to what the panel says. It's not so much that we want to put up a brick wall and say, don't socialize. But I think just in your interactions, how are you socializing and what determines when you're inappropriate? Because you will make a fool of yourself. And oftentimes that's when the best policies, you don't want to be the fool, but you're like, go ahead, Dave, you try it out, and hopefully no one hears his name is Dave, but go ahead, Steve, gosh, Dave or Steve, sorry. But let them make those mistakes, and then you start forming those policies, but we use that. There's also an institution that used to have like these great, like the Techno Oops Awards. The mistakes that they made, but the policies and the lessons that they learned from that. It's like, okay, so what you don't want to do is to leave your iPod or your iPad on the stove. And they ranked these awards, but what it did was it allowed the conversation to occur in a very harmless environment where they could laugh and say, I made that mistake, but I don't want to do it again. And that kind of helps as the technology evolves. Now with the cyberbullying component of it, there's a lot. This is where it's tricky because I think we focus so much on Facebook and Twitter that we forget that it was around 2006 or 2007 that every campus had to deal with Juicy Campus. And Juicy Campus allowed the students to post and make anonymous posts about anything they wanted to do. And there was huge injunctions because a lot of campuses said, we're blocking JuicyCampus.com. And they came back and sent out mass emails to the students and saying the university is blocking your First Amendment right to have anonymous posts. And they were posting some, advisors that sleep with students, faculty that are using the same test, the good girls of this dorm, the bad girls of this dorm. And it was right after the heels of the Virginia Tech shooting. And we had to have a social media conversation with our alumni, with our students, faculty. The whole family had to come together and say, look, this is going to hurt our reputation because allowing someone to post, what does that do for a freshman when your name pops up on a page anonymously saying that you're doing activities that may or may not be true? What does that say for a faculty? And you're just left out there vulnerable. So that's why I mentioned in my comments, you have to even have those students at the table and also alumni, because they can go on a rant. I mean, we're coming off the heels of March Madness, but after teams lose, man, those alumni will go off on your university. Fire this coach, fire that first, and you're just sitting there, in kind of lame duck mode, like I wasn't even playing. I told him don't shoot. I told him don't shoot, and he shot the ball. What am I supposed to do? And so you have to have those general conversations because it's not just the individuals on campus. Oftentimes, it's the university family as a whole that needs to just understand that this is a new way that we're communicating, but we have to do it in an educated manner. We have to make sure that the integrity of the university is still upfront and intact, and we have to make sure that the policies don't limit us, but do keep all of us safe.
Thank you.
I mean, I agree with what's been said so far, but I want to add, I think these two examples sort of suggest that one aspect of our policies need to be to recognize that we're educators. And one of our things we need to do is educate about how to use electronic media, social media, educate our students, but also educate ourselves about what these mean. I mean, my first reaction to the posting of this professor's hot, this one isn't. I'm less concerned about the ones who are named, and I'd be resentful that I wasn't. But I think that's the thing. The proper reaction of the faculty should be ignore it. Now, among students, universities may have student codes of conduct. They may have student rules of what is appropriate, and those may vary by the nature of the institution, and there are legal restrictions on those too as well. But that's a little different from the faculty side. The cyberbullying is a little more complicated, but in a certain sense, it doesn't really change the fundamental principle that let's take it out of the cyber area, that one colleague keeps walking into another colleague's office and being obnoxious and acting in ways that makes that other colleague, especially maybe the one who's in the office who's being bullied in this case is a new faculty member, doesn't have tenure, the other one's senior, blah, blah, you know, that shouldn't be happening, and the university should have policy around it, whether it's happening in cyberspace or office space. But it has to be clear, and there have to be clear, you know, due process rules. And it gets tricky, we all know that. But it gets tricky not just in the cyber world, it gets tricky in the world. So, you know, no policy, nothing is going to help us solve every human problem. I mean, we're faculty and students in the university community is filled with human beings with all our flaws.
It's ironic that the second part of your question, that the person who created Facebook, now a multi-billionaire, the purpose of that was to rate the appearance of people. There's a question back here.
My question is related to the social media policies. Do they tend to differentiate clauses within the policies aimed toward faculty and staff as opposed to students? And if so, kind of how does that play?
The question pertains to differentiation between students and faculty staff with regard to social media policy.
Do you want to take it?
From the AAP's perspective, we think that academic freedom is not just simply the First Amendment applied to the classroom. Academic freedom derives ultimately from the professional standing of the faculty, and not just simply, you know, the same basis that in the classroom, you know, it isn't a sort of free marketplace of ideas, and you know, you take a vote at the end. Is in this math class, 3 plus 3 was 7. You know, it just doesn't work that way, right? So the regulation of student use of social media may be different from regulation of faculty and staff use, or particularly faculty use. I mean, personally, I would lean also as students toward as open as possible, as free as possible, because I think that's the most healthy environment, especially if accompanied by the kind of, and I think, you know, Michael's idea of there being tutorial things that people can go to see, here is the way you use it, you know, these would be very, very helpful for students. One area I know that we referenced in our report, you know, some universities, with respect to electronic communication, have been trying to limit how much bandwidth any person can use on the campus. And part of it is because you get students in the dorms downloading, well, first it was pirated music, and then the university gets liable by the record companies going after them, and now it's just downloading whole movies, whether pirated or paid for, it's still using up amazing amounts of resources, and a lot of universities have said we're going to limit the amount of bandwidth in dormitories. If you apply that to faculty, I think it's wrong, because faculty, I mean, what if you have a film professor who needs to watch a lot of films? So, you know, the policies needn't be the same.
But I think also with that, one of the things that I've done with my teacher ed candidates, and I think it's just because of the nature of particularly how we view educators in social media, it's not the same as if you're talking to your doctor. And you have, I mean, if you have an ailment right now and you go on WebMD and say, oh God, I think I have the blue chicken flu. So let me email my doctor and say, do I have the blue chicken flu? And if you're having that type of dialogue, there's no problem with that, because we kind of expect that if you're talking to your doctor, if you're online having a conversation with your lawyer or your accountant. But particularly with education, the expectation, the standards are high. So when I work with my teacher ed candidates, we slowly transition them from their student life into their professional life. And we have that conversation about advocacy, what is your professional role, and basically what is your online DNA. Also with new faculty, because when I want someone to do a Google search on Dr. Nicole Kendall, do I want Goofy Me to float up in there with that same aspect? Because in academia, oftentimes when you're being selected for conferences, when people are looking for your research, they want professional you. They don't want to know that I had a, Superman, double scoop of Superman ice cream yesterday at Baskin and Robbins. That has no bearing on my professional life. And so when we're helping students, and I would even say this goes beyond just teacher education, but as you're helping your students go from their freshman years, and we were all freshmen, so don't act like you don't have a past, but you just took a Polaroid picture and kept it to yourself. But that looks different than when you're a senior and you're trying to apply for a job, and you want that image of yourself to be career ready, and you don't want it to be tarnished by spring break 2008. So we try to talk to them, and it's not a parenting lecture, but we just take them through those tutorials and those exercises in which I say, let me go ahead and do an online background check of you and see what your online DNA looks like. And their jaws will drop and they'll say, well, what do you mean? Let me go online and just see what I can find out about you. Oh, here's your Pandora list. These are the movies you rented from Netflix. You may not want to know that. But you go down and do that whole screening and they realize that their world is open. But that's not something I want them to find out their senior year. I want them aware, okay, you've been in college for 2 years. What things can we let go of? What habits do I now want to adopt? And again, it goes back to my comment about online discrimination. That's a new issue that's going to come down the pipeline that I know there's not a lot of research out on right now, but it's a way for me to discriminate against you based off of what you've posted online. Because I know what legally I cannot discriminate. I mean, those rules are intact. I cannot discriminate against you based off of race or gender or those things are locked in. But if you make yourself look like you're a bad representation of my company or my institution, I can deny you admission. That's harder to track. But I can base it off of your own posting and your own activities. So that's what we even help the high school and junior high school students to understand in terms of how those policies, even in the K-12 sector, should help those students to develop healthy online habits so that you don't have issues of cyberbullying and things occurring in the higher ed sector. Can't stop it, but they're a little bit more educated.
I'll add one other thing on the policy. So I'm a big believer in federalism, which means that I like to have a centralized policy that applies to everyone, yet provides an opportunity within the policy to depart and cover other areas and other parties where necessary. So what I mean by that is I talked about academic freedom earlier. Section 7 rights certainly apply to everyone. But we've added specific issues in our policy to cover things like accessibility. That's something that we haven't talked about here today, but certainly in the academic context, there's been Department of Education investigations around the idea of using things like Facebook for official class exercises that might limit the participatory abilities of people with sight impairments or hearing impairments. So we want to take that opportunity through the policy to remind people to think about issues like that. Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA. I'll throw some acronyms at you. Like Hank mentioned earlier, the idea of limiting bandwidth for downloads. Harvard gets I don't know how many letters every month from Federal Trade Commission or whomever else, the Columbia Pictures, whoever it is that's out there regulating DMCA, saying you're downloading things illegally, you need to stop it. Fair Credit Reporting Act. That's something that we remind our folks in the recruiting side of the house to think about when they're going out there and they're either doing candidate searches or making offers of employment. We have specific channels that we use for those types of activities, and we want people to remember why it's a bad idea to extend those channels into social media realms.
I have sort of a practical policy question. It's a bit of a corner case, but I'm the head of I'm David Kochemba. I'm president of AFEC AAUP, which is a adjunct-only collective bargaining unit. And with these policies, I mean, my practical sort of approach to this is to ask, how much of a priority do I really need to make this? Because in order to sort of enact some of your suggestions, I have to expend pretty precious political capital at the bargaining table for things that will only avoid bad results and never bring anything good to my membership. And so I guess what I'm wondering here is especially since adjunct faculty play no role in writing these policies in the first place, they're written by the faculty, which is generally considered to be full-time, tenure-track, tenure-line faculties. Is this something that adjunct faculty should really be, like, is this a hill adjunct faculty unit should die on to make sure we have the best possible policy, or just leave well enough alone?
Thank you. Thank you. Rephrasing that question, the question has to do with what priority contingent or adjunct faculty should place on the creation of a social media policy, recognizing the amount of political capital that would be expended in the process.
I would say I don't think it needs to, you said die on the hill. I don't think it needs to be your bunker hill, but I think you definitely need to be in the valley, maybe. Only because adjuncts depending on where you are, adjuncts are in a unique situation that they oftentimes don't get access to the school email system in a timely manner, depending on when the contract is filed and this, that, and the other. And so I know some of my adjunct colleagues, when I was interim department head, that was their means of communication. They had a Gmail account, they put it out there, their students would link up on Google Plus, and because they were waiting for paperwork to get signed, and they were like, if I don't have something, I'm out of communication with my students for 3 or 4 weeks, and that's just unacceptable. Waiting for logistical processes. So it's maybe not the priority one, but I definitely think that it's something that you should be aware of and be mindful of in terms of how that affects contingent faculty that may, if the process keeps them out of the loop from contacting their students, how does social media support them having a learning environment until one has been established for them by the institution? And then once that has been established, then they roll into it. But that gray area in which they're not in the actual university network and things like that, and they still have to provide instruction, I think that's where your social media policy should address it, and that's where you serve it. And then once they have access to the infrastructure, the intranet, then they should adopt the policies that the university has in place for them.
I think with respect to the academic freedom aspects, I think, as you know very well, David, that adjuncts are the most vulnerable to having their academic freedom denied. And therefore, any policy advantage that protects them, while yes, it's sort of protecting against a bad thing as opposed to gaining people a good thing, it is a protection that is better for them, than anyone else. And I think general protections of academic freedom in contracts that can be extended to electronic communications are good things. Whether to make that the sort of sword you fall on in bargaining is a decision that everybody has to make for themselves. Let me just give an example. I was on the California Faculty Association bargaining team for many years. In our last round, we've never had a contract provision specifically about academic freedom. As a general statement, this contract is for academic freedom in the preamble. One of the reasons is because the CSU has been pretty good on academic freedom. We haven't had many real problems. We brought a proposal on that forward, and I wrote a whole draft article on academic freedom that sort of spelled out more specifically some of the things. They said, well, why are you bringing this up? Or, don't you think our record is good? And we said, yeah, the record is good. And guess what happened? When final contract happened, that article didn't get in there. because the record was fairly good, so we didn't push that hard. And their feeling was, the record is pretty good, why are you pushing this on us? I wish you could get in there. I've been lobbying, I'm no longer on the bargaining team, but I've been lobbying that at the end of this round of bargaining. Again, just because it would be good additional protections. But, you know, those are tactical questions, I think, that, you know, anybody makes in bargaining, whether you're bargaining for an entire unit of, like we were, for both tenure track and contingent faculty, or whether you're bargaining just for contingent faculty or whatever.
Thinking about it quickly from the perspective that you're approaching it, since, you know, adjunct organizing is a hot topic in a lot of areas, and I came to your panel earlier, and I follow the issue fairly closely since it happens in my area right now. I would think about this from two perspectives before you even get to the policy level, which is, one, you know, how are you preparing your adjuncts to utilize social media in organizing? And so the article that I brought here from the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School has an article about how to use social media in negotiations, and it uses the NFL Players Association as an example. I think it was their 2011 contract that they signed with the NFL, which, if you recall, had some pretty heavy FMCS intervention, had a number of players tweeting about the bargaining table. I would say that, you know, having folks that are probably used to using social media but maybe not in a labor context, you know, thinking about how they can be most effective in an organizing campaign would be, you know, one place to focus in on. And then when you actually get to the bargaining table, I know there's, I was in another panel earlier today that talked about, you know, what are some effective ground rules out there that you can talk about at the bargaining table. And I think one contemporary ground rule that I've found effective recently is one that talks about specifically what roles social media, if any, will play in the negotiation. And so, you know, you'll see a lot of ground rules if you do negotiations on a regular basis. We'll include something about, you know, some sort of cooling off period for going to the media. It's usually, you know, 48 hours or so. I would advocate for extending that to social media as well. You know, I don't care what kind of cooling off period you put on it, just so long as you do have some sort of cooling off period. Because as we all know, emotion carries the day in so many ways when you're posting something through your Facebook page, your Twitter feed, or what have you. So, you know, I've got a stack of papers that look like this of letters that I wrote in the heat of the moment and said, let me wait 24 hours and sleep on it before I send it, that I actually sent. I've got a stack that's this high of the ones that I wrote, and then I said, no, I better not send that. So I think, you know, thinking in those terms about, you know, what you might tweet out about the bargaining table will help preserve the sanctity of collective bargaining, you know, the trust and the mutual collaboration that you're trying to build there. And so people that are, you know, younger, and, you know, I'm not trying to say that the adjunct faculty out there are by any means young, but perhaps, you know, as a rule, but, you know, maybe the folks that are trying to lead some of the charges nowadays might be more in line with contemporary social media practices. They might not be as in line with collective bargaining, so it would be helpful to have that kind of conversation.
We have a few minutes left, time for one more question, and maybe one of our panelists to react.
Kevin West, University of Toledo. The nature of social media, to me at least, seems that it degrades rather fast. So you can have intellectual discussion at a certain level, but sooner or later it degrades into some other kind of discourse. And I just wanted to bring that up from an administrative perspective, that you don't want to violate academic freedom. At the same time, those things that are posted can have negative impacts on your institution, whether that's a hostile work environment or a hostile learning environment, or an adjunct faculty member may say something and then be sued individually for the effects of those things. Another reason to think about having a policy. But those are things that I started to see, that it's not from the university where these things are raised, but outside agencies that are looking at the environment. There's when that complainant brings forward a list of 175 tweets about what happened in that residence hall, what happened in that classroom, when faculty are commenting on a completely outside blog, but there are statements about race or ethnicity, when those people are bringing those complaints forward, those things really impact the institution. So we all need to be mindful of that as well.
I think we do, but I think one response to that, and it's not to minimize the issues, particularly for the poor administrators who have to take the flack for the stupid things that some members of the university community end up saying, and which flash back, is I was recruited by one of the professional associations for their journals to write a little article on this and on social media policies, and it was actually the editor there that gave me the headline. And the headline she suggested was, "Get a social media policy, / and a backbone." Because if you have a policy that basically says, we support academic freedom, etc., and then you stand up for it and you say, look, this is the nature of a university. In the short run, you take some hits, But I think even more dangerous to the university in the long run is to become the kind of institution where, we keep checking our speech all the time to make sure we're not offending our funders, we're not offending the legislators, who sometimes can be really crazy, right? The alumni, whatever group it is. And ultimately, then the next thing you know, the fundamental values of education are being threatened. So really, it's a balancing act, of course, at any time, and I certainly can sympathize with those people, especially in advancement offices, who the very day that they're supposed to be going out to some potential donor or something that's really going to be good, or recruitment people for students, and that day some stupid stuff happens in the university, and you wish, God, how couldn't that person have not said that? It's hard.
The time has come in the program for me to thank you for your attendance, for your participation, to remind you that there is an evaluation form for the conference, and to ask you to spend a little time with it. And most of all, will you join me in thanking our panelists?
Jeffrey Cross moderated this panel discussion about social media in labor relations and student contact, best policies, practices, and training. Cross is Assistant Vice President for Academic Affairs at Eastern Illinois University. The panelists are Nicole Kendall, Associate Professor, Department of Teaching and Learning at Tennessee State University, Michael Locanto, Associate Director of Labor and Employee Relations at Harvard University, and Henry Reichman, Vice President of the American Association of University Professors. The National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining and the Professions thanks the panelists, and the Hunter College Institutional Computing and Information Technology Department for making this webcast possible.